In my view, the Russian response to events in the Ukraine were entirely predictable. When I served in the White House in 1998-99, I was working on Latin America, but I had colleagues who worked on Eastern Europe and Europe. And I remember asking some of them, why are we taking NATO right up to the border of Russia? What was the reason for that? And the answer I got was very simple. They lost, we won. And US policy, without much thinking in my view, focused on extending NATO right up to the borders of Russia, so that by recent history, NATO members include Romania, Poland. Those were countries in the old Warsaw Pact, but also included the Baltic countries, which were actually part of the Soviet Union. So looking at this from the point of view of Russia, why is the Cold War is over? Why did the United States and the Western Europeans insist upon taking NATO, an alliance to protect Europe against the Soviet Union, which didn't exist anymore? Why did we take it to the very borders of Russia? And then in the past several months, and meanwhile, by the way, we have brought Ukraine and Georgia in, not into NATO, but into partnership relationships with NATO. There are Ukrainian troops serving with US troops in peacekeeping missions, such as in Kosovo. Meanwhile, what happens? Well, now the EU is finally getting around to making a sort of half-hearted gesture to Ukraine, to bring Ukraine into some sort of political relationship with the EU. And Ukraine is the origin of what the Russians believe to be their civilization, which originated around Kyiv. Yanukovych falls. Putin's plan A doesn't work out, which is to keep influence in Ukraine through Yanukovych. And they make a deal, giving Yanukovych a period of time for a transition. The day after the deal falls apart, you have the United States Assistant Secretary of State for Europe recorded in a phone call, micromanaging the opposition to Yanukovych. So from the Russian point of view, you see the march of NATO up to the border. You see the United States and the EU trying to extend its influence right into what they considered part of their heartland. And there was a reaction. And the reaction, I think, was initially diplomatic. I think they were open to a deal on Crimea. But instead of looking into a possibility of a deal, we insisted that they withdraw, which they were never going to do. An interesting fact is that when the Russians first went into Crimea, they did not send troops with Russian uniforms. They sent troops without insignia. That, to me, was a clear signal that they were open to a diplomatic resolution that would allow them to withdraw their troops in return for an agreement on increased autonomy, something, without ever having to admit they had troops. And nevertheless, we lost that opportunity, and even now, it's not clear whether we and the Europeans are going to support a diplomatic solution which preserves Russian interest in the Ukraine, because they have them, while also preserving Ukraine's sovereignty. And in the past few days, we can see that the Russians are once again putting further pressure on. I don't know if Putin will go any further. I suspect he won't, because that would lead to real instability, and he doesn't benefit from that. But on the other hand, we haven't had an effective diplomacy yet either. It's another example to me of what kind of trouble you can get into when you actually don't have a foreign policy, when what you have is rhetoric. And the rhetoric here is support for democracy. Well, what does that mean? And what does it mean to support democracy when we actually have nothing that we can do in a tangible way?